Hey everybody, Johnny the Queer POTUS here, and today I have a very special treat for you. My friend, colleague, and fellow historian Kevin Lukacs is here to talk to us about the Spanish Civil War through the eyes of two very extraordinary individuals, Ernest Hemingway and Langston Hughes. I had the opportunity to interview Kevin on my Twitch stream recently, and the conversation was just absolutely fascinating. So here it is, presented in all its glory, our discussion of Hemingway, Hughes, and the Spanish Civil War. Enjoy. Okay, cool. So, ladies and gentlemen out there in podcast, or I guess whatever this is, streamcast land, I have a very special guest here on the stream. Looks like we have a couple of people here, so that's pretty good. This is Kevin. Kevin and I work together at an undisclosed location. You want to tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, Kevin?
Yeah, I'm a historian. I work with Johnny where we do good public history work. I also just finished my master's degree at American University, which was a nightmare. Don't send anyone there, ever. For many reasons.
Right.
Really enjoyed that. I came most recently from Pennsylvania where I did my undergrad. And while I was working there, I was also freelancing. I did a lot of work for some theaters in the area. I wrote some plays, which was really cool. And I've kind of let that guide me sort of trying to be a historian and come at it with a view for the arts as well. And it's still shockingly controversial in a lot of history circles to want to use art as a primary source for history and to look at it as a very serious record of emotions and goings on. And so I've tried to keep that central to my work, is looking at human art and how it in fact impacts history and vice versa and historical memory. And I haven't talked about this all in a long time, so like I'm getting more excited as I talk about it.
That's good. They hear enough of my voice on this channel as is, so this is an opportunity to hear a little bit of a different voice. So you have been finding ways to explore art as well as history together. I see that I'm guessing your shirt says "The Sun Also Rises." Is that a Hemingway shirt?
Yeah, this is I got this from out of print.
Nice.
It's my son. Since we're talking about Spain, a large part of that book takes place in Spain. So
yeah, so that book is inspired by Hemingway's travels in Spain.
Yeah, so Hemingway obviously is an expatriate. So after World War I, which he spends in Italy, he lives in France for a while as a journalist, spends a lot of time in Spain, a lot of time in Austria as well, and in the Alps. And Spain is like a special haven for him. Some of the ways he talks about it, obviously, I'm not going to just sing Hemingway's praises. I probably won't do that a lot, actually, at all. But he takes a very sort of his descriptions of Spain sound very colonialist because he talks about it as a very natural place. He talks about the people as being very simple and down to earth, and sort of rivals in Spain as sort of like on the edge of being a savage place because he goes down there to see the bullfights. And the bullfights are a very horrific thing to see. They're very dangerous, but he sees a lot of very classic masculinity in it and sort of a lost world. And that's what Spain is to him. And so later when we talk about the Spanish Civil War, that's what Hemingway's going to go and see, is this natural, beautiful place that's being soiled by all these by all this war and all the foreigners who are coming in and making the war worse.
Do you think there's like a James Fenimore Cooper thing there too, like the noble savage sort of going on?
Yeah, actually, in Sun Also Rises, a couple great discussions I have about that book that tend to be the most interesting are about pretty much the only female character in the book, and one of the Spanish characters who's an innkeeper, and sort of the way he interacts with the young people in the book. It can be very difficult to get a vibe from him, and I think that what he's supposed to represent is this noble Spanish peasant who pays very close attention to bullfighting, but has no identity outside of that. So I definitely think the people of Spain kind of are noble savages for him, in much the way that he looks at the French and the Italian and Germans as like civilized people. I don't think he extends that sort of metropolitanness to the Spanish, at least not in his writings. Yeah.
And do you think so? One of the other people that you looked into for this study of the Spanish Civil War and of Spain was Langston Hughes, and so both of these characters took trips to Spain before all of the violence broke out. Is that correct?
Yeah. So Hemingway went in the 1920s when he was living in France, in the later 1920s, and then Hughes also in 1923, I think it was, he stopped in Spain on his way to Africa. So Langston Hughes, when he's growing up, he's biracial. He's pretty light-skinned. He doesn't have very strong sort of African features, which is going to be very important when he gets to Africa. And so one of the things that he and a lot of his generation that grows up sort of post-Jim Crow, where they didn't know slavery, and they're not going to be a big parts of like the civil rights movement. They're in that middle horrible era where Jim Crow is the norm. He feels like he has no home, which is a big theme in his poetry. So as a young man, he takes his job on a ship going to Africa because he's like, there I can see other Africans and be accepted despite the color of my skin. So he goes through, he sees Spain, he thinks it's very beautiful. He loves the diversity of Spain and that it seems race relations seem much more casual there in the United States. He gets to Africa, and Africans don't like him. They call him a white man. They see his biracial phenotypes, and they are very put off by them. And he finds that he's not welcome in Africa by Africans either. And so this is sort of a journey of finding himself and realizing that if America is not going to open their homes to him, he's going to force them to, as an artist, as an activist. And so it's a very positive sense of activism comes out of this really, really depressing moment of being discluded, of not having a home.
Right. Wow. So Langston Hughes must have felt this kind of sense of not really belonging anywhere he went, whether he went to, I mean, you compare it to like Frederick Douglass's trip to Ireland or something where, you know, he was treated like a king, a god almost, and then compare it to Langston Hughes' trips to Africa, and you kind of feel like where could he go where he would feel special?
Yeah, and in some ways that's Spain because that's where he goes and he doesn't feel abnormal. But what's really ironic about this, and that he writes about as well, is that in many ways Spain is the home of the Atlantic slave trade. Portugal has a big hand in seeing it started, but Spain really helps push it. I mean, with all the territory that they own in the New World, and the Dutch are a big part of it in English. But when he talks about Spain as the home of slavery, and that this country of all places is one where he feels the most welcome. And it's not just his biracialness as well. I mean, Langston Hughes, as far as we know today, was a queer poet, like a lot of good poets were.
Yeah.
And so he feels discluded from that as well. And so even in his own cultures where he might be more accepted in Harlem, let's say, for being biracial, he might be less accepted for being queer in addition to that. So Langston Hughes was somebody who could not find his place very easily, who was so undeniably an incredible artist, an incredible voice, that now he's like one of the poet laureates of the United States.
Right. That's interesting. All right. So both of these people who have much different experiences in life, they both take this visit at some point to Spain. They're both captured by what they see. They go back home. They live their lives. They write their poems and their stories. And then they get drawn back to Spain again. What draws, let's start with Hughes. What draws Hughes back to Spain?
So for Hughes, one of the reasons he goes to Spain is to represent a different voice in the news, because when everything kicks off, and we can talk about that next, it's very clear that the world is going to have its eyes on Spain, and the world consists of black people who also want to know what's going on in Spain through a voice that they're going to recognize, they're going to see things that are important to them. So the Baltimore Afro-American, which at the time, one of the largest papers in the United States, and the largest black-owned paper, the second largest was in Pittsburgh, which I didn't know. Pretty cool. Shout out to Pittsburgh. Yeah, the Pittsburgh Gazette. I won't name the professor, but I had a professor who told me that the Pittsburgh Gazette as a black paper was not a valid source because its circulation wasn't big enough.
Right on.
I was like, I think that's racist, actually.
Yeah, colonialist at least, which is racist.
Yeah. Anyway, so Hughes sees this really important moment. He is someone, he believes in socialist values. He believes in economic revolution. And it's hard because a lot of people won't outright call themselves communists, but definitely Langston Hughes is there to support the communist cause for the communists in Spain who are leading the one side of the war. But he wants to go there so that black people have somebody like them to hear this news from. And then he gets there and he sees the black people fighting in the war, and that he wants to tell their stories. And that's sort of what drew me to it, because this project started, I just wanted to learn about the Spanish Civil War. And then I wanted to sort of do it as an American, looking at the Americans who went there and the biases they brought, the stories they tried to bring home. And it took me a whole month of reading books to find out Langston Hughes was even in the Spanish Civil War as a reporter. And I found it in a footnote. All these books from the 30s and the 80s, and the most recent was from 2015. It's a book this thick about war correspondence in Spain. Langston Hughes isn't in it at all. He's not a footnote. He's not mentioned. And that's a book that's 5 years old. And so I wanted to talk about Hughes, but I wanted to compare him to his compatriots, and I wanted to sort of juxtapose him and build off him with a more familiar character. And for me, that was Hemingway. As a fan of his works as a young man, like a lot of people get drawn in, and then looking at the way that Hemingway was discussed in the history books, he's normally mentioned, like, yes, he was there, but so rarely do historians look at things like novels or poems as interesting historical documents. And so I wanted to give Hemingway the chance to be a piece of history and not just a character in history.
Right. So, and I see a cat there, so that's good.
Which one? Oh, yeah, that's Charlie.
Hey, Charlie. Whoa, a little bit of laser eyes going, too. I love it.
Oh, yeah.
Hey, buddy. How you doing?
Should be in and out.
Nice. All right. So we have two journalists, two people who are drawn to Spain. Do you think that Langston Hughes had some sense that there was something in Spain he wanted to bring back to America? One of the things that we find a lot in the studying African American experience, whether it's fighting in wars with like, you know, you and I studied the Civil War often, and the African American troop experience, it's often there's a sense of, well, once we fight something, we're going to fight an enemy for the Union, then we're going to fight an enemy at home. We're going to fight racism. And like through this experience, we're going to learn something that we're going to bring back to our country. And a lot of the Buffalo Soldiers who go to Spanish-American War, which is something we talked about on the channel last week, they have this sense we're going to go out and fight there. We're going to fight in World War I and World War II. We're going to bring back something to the United States that's going to change the racial dynamics and give us a chance to move ahead. So do you think there was something for Langston Hughes that he thought he could bring back from Spain that would stoke the fire of the socialist movement, the movement for black equality? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, definitely Langston is going to, everyone who goes into the war as a reporter is, whether they recognize it or not when they get there, because a lot of them have very transformative effects, either for good or for better. They're going to realize that this Spanish conflagration is a global issue, and that's going to be literally true in terms of who's involved, but it's also going to be very ideologically true. And the Spanish Civil War is going to start painting some of America in a really terrible light, in a way that World War II is going to blow up in a lot of big ways. So in some ways, the Spanish Civil War is a prologue to World War II and sort of starts making us ask these questions. So on one hand, Langston Hughes is going because he's supporting a government that is largely consists of socialists that took over power legitimately, that is being overthrown in a coup by conservative forces, Catholics, military, elites, monarchists. And so there's a sense that we have to restore this socialist government to prove that socialism, when it's not being so viciously attacked, can be successful. Because in the 30s, you are getting some. It's not going to be as bad as McCarthyism quite, but there's sort of that Red Scare vibe is already well implanted after the Russian Revolution in the 30s, by the 30s. So he's going there as a socialist to prop up this socialist government. And he is going there to support them and defend them to people back home as well, to try to paint lights and portraits of, like, these are good people. These are not people to be scared of. They're compassionate. They have goals in mind. He's also going as an anti-fascist. At this point, Mussolini's been in power for over 10 years. Hitler's been in power in Germany for several years, and he's scaring a lot of people. And fascism, it's going to do it much more dramatically in World War II. It's going to wake people up to how close America was to a lot of fascist ideals, to how much the Nazis were inspired by American politics and practices, from Supreme Court decisions to Jim Crow laws. The Nazis learn a lot from Jim Crow when they decide what they're going to do about the Jewish population in Europe, unfortunately. And then when he sees that, he's going to paint that light, that similarity between fascism and Jim Crow, very directly. One of my favorite quotes from him, and I'm sort of paraphrasing, he says the only difference between Francisco Franco, the fascist head of the Spanish coup, and the KKK was that the KKK wore a white hood. And he said that ultimately, when you really broke it down, the goal of fascism was to create a world that was only for whites. It was for whites alone. And so he wants to go back and as Americans are flirting with fascism in the 30s, the same way they're flirting with these socially liberal ideas that FDR is putting through, you have people like George Bush's grandfather who are flirting with fascism.
Right.
A lot of Hollywood types. And even some black people are also thinking, like, wouldn't it be good if just someone came in to save the day? And Hughes is trying to point out that you don't want that person in there because it's going to end like this. So it starts in the Spanish Civil War. You have a lot of people screaming that if we don't do something about fascism now, it's going to get worse. And 3 years later, in 1939, Germany invades Poland, and we have the largest war ever, hopefully. And it's so many people who just were utterly destroyed by that fact. I really like Hemingway in his Farewell to Arms, his anti-war book about World War One. He issues it in 1948 with this new introduction, where he says that he gets a lot of criticism for writing about war. But he's like, in my life, I've seen World War One, I've seen the Chinese-Japanese War, I've seen the Spanish Civil War, I've seen World War Two. The reason I'm obsessed with war is because it's this crime that never stops, and we have to keep declaring against it. And so the Spanish Civil War for them is going to be this platform to try to do that. And ultimately, they're all unsuccessful. The fascists win very handily, and World War II starts.
And it's interesting because you mentioned in your paper that the fascists kind of presented this sort of they were usurping power in Spain, and then you had this rebellion against that. But the rebellion was not so clearly communist, and even especially through Hemingway, who you say has a lot of problems with the communists and is a little bit more sympathetic to the Republicans. That there's not a united coalition force fighting against the fascists.
Yeah, so let's sort of like take that back a little bit and sort of start from square one. So the Spanish Empire, for a lot of what we consider sort of Western history, like post-Renaissance to now, this era of Western nations sort of dominating the narrative, at least, and the eras of white supremacy and white supremacist thought. Spain has a big hand in a lot of that, or what we now consider Spain, like Spanish kings, the Spanish Empire, the way they dominate the New World, the way they lead a lot of politics in Europe. But really, for about 100 years leading up to the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish Empire is in serious decline, and it's a third-rate world power. And by the 1930s, a lot of people might consider Spain essentially like a third world country. And you have a lot of political circles who are wondering when stability is going to come to Spain. So by the 1930s, the monarchy has entirely collapsed. The monarch has fled Spain. In fact, for you guys who know, the king of Spain at the time was of the Bourbon dynasty, that's the same dynasty as Louis XVI from the French Revolution. So up in the 1930s, they were still ruling a European country. And actually, when Francisco Franco finally was taken out of power in 1976, he was replaced by a Bourbon ruler. And even today, the Bourbons still are the monarchs of Spain. So still going strong, 400 years after the revolution. So when I found that out, it was so crazy. But anyway, so the government collapsed, and the country very quickly splits into a very solid right-wing coalition and a very loose left-wing coalition. The right-wing coalition was really shocked by the dissolution of the monarchy, and this right wing was people who on the surface didn't look like they initially shared too much, but they're all wealthy, they're all invested in the system. It's people who are invested in religion, wealthy Catholics, it's the military, it's monarchists. And so they're trying to reel back from losing all this power suddenly. And then the left, which is largely socialist, but it's also anarchist, more traditional, like Republican type people, like people who just want a representative democracy, but it's largely socialist. It's that time in Europe. They, in the first election in Spain, actually take up a great deal of power. They have a pretty big majority. But once they have it, they're not sure what to do with it. And when the right coalesces with all of their wealth and all their connections, they stage a lot of disruptions in the leftist government. And the leftist government looks like it's going to not be able to functionally run, although it's being sort of sabotaged from the inside by the right. And then eventually, after this campaign of internal sabotage seems to be going too slow for them, these military leaders finally rise up against the government. So they are the rebels, and it's very confusing because typically we associate rebels and revolution with the left. But this is a revolution of the right. and they overthrow the government with a lot of help from the colonial troops in Africa, including black Moroccan troops, and they take over about 3/4 of the country. Within a couple days, they have everything but the capital and the Mediterranean coast. So Cartagena, I got my map back here somewhere, and a few other cities along the left coast, right coast. So that's what you have at the beginning of this. You have a legally elected leftist government, largely socialist, that is being conquered by a coup from the military. So right away, the people on the fence, they're on the fence because they're like, this is an illegitimate military overthrow, but they're overthrowing socialists, and as an American, I don't know how to feel about that.
Right.
And international sort of feelings are going to coalesce over this. You're going to have the Russians obviously supporting the socialists. You'll have the fascists supporting Franco, Germany, Italy. And the United States and Britain aren't sure what to do. And then when Russia starts supporting the socialists, now they're not just socialists, they're Russian commies. And FDR is going to try as hard as he can to stay as far away from communists as he possibly can. And so you're going to find that the Russian help, as instrumental it was into keeping the loyalist government, the Republican government afloat, is actually going to be one of the things in the long run that completely sabotages them because the United States, Great Britain, these important powers refuse to get involved with someone who's supported by the Russians.
And we had brigades like the Lincoln Brigade of American soldiers going over there. Was that sort of a spontaneous volunteer, sort of like vanguardism, or was it actually sponsored by the United States government?
No, actually quite the opposite. The United States government was deeply incensed about this. So the Spanish loyalists called for help from outside powers, and when the United States instituted their policy of neutrality, the American people didn't all agree with that. So almost 3,000 Americans went to go fight as soldiers, like Lord Byron did 200 years before that. A lot of young people, when they got there, some of these foreign units, the loyalists didn't think it would actually do them a lot of good press to have all these foreigners dying as soldiers. So there were initially two brigades, the Abraham Lincoln and the George Washington. Eventually, and this is a win for Abe, the George Washington brigade, which is largely for show, is dissolved, and they're all coalesced in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. And of the 2,700 Americans that go over as combatants, 800 of them are killed in the fighting. Fast forward, they come home largely before 1939. They're investigated by the FBI as possibly dangerous persons. They're blacklisted, so they're kept from getting hired. They're not allowed to join unions, things of that sort. And they pretty much are hated until the day they die. They do think there's this brief moment in World War II where they're like, now people will see that like fighting the fascists was the only thing to do in 1936. They're not allowed to join the army because they're considered dangerous. Even though they're like super experienced at fighting fascists and Nazis. They're terribly oppressed, and there are black and white people in the Abraham Lincoln Brigades, and it does them no good when they get home. It actually hurts them tremendously.
That's fascinating, because you do find that in wartime, and this is something I just cannot understand myself. This is the idea that people are excited to sign up and fight in a war because this is their opportunity for advancement, to prove their mettle, to potentially set the course for the rest of their life and their own personal success. And so being sort of blacklisted from the military or being told, we don't want you to fight in the war is actually something that would bother people. And it's something I find hard to imagine, but
I mean, you also think that in that era after World War II, where like your whole personality is defined on whether or not you served, and your functionality as a member of society is asking what you were doing during World War II, and these guys would say like, I was blacklisted because I fought fascists.
Wow.
Which actually, going way back, that was my initial sort of view into the Spanish Civil War, and the first time I even heard about it, because I was never taught this in school. I would ask college professors about it who had no idea, who really didn't even know where to send me to start, was because in the movie Casablanca, the main character played by Humphrey Bogart, Rick fought for the loyalist side in Spain, and I had no idea what that meant. So I Googled that as a young man and found this whole new thing to learn about the Spanish Civil War and about all this stuff. And 10 10 years later, I finally did this research project where I got to really dive in deep about it. I didn't mention Casablanca in the paper, and I think that was to my detriment.
Yes. Well, don't worry. None of it will amount to a hill of beans anyway, in the end. So what you're telling me basically is that we had a legitimate leftist, or was it a leftist government or a kind of liberal provisional government, or where exactly was it?
It was a leftist parliamentary government. So they had legally taken over Spain in very clear, very fair elections. They just lost, and the rightists just lost. Most of the representatives and I don't have the numbers readily available. Most of the representatives identified as socialists, and then there were a few anarchists who came out. Anarchist movements. This is I didn't spend a lot of time on the anarchists themselves, but if I remember correctly, there were a fair bit of labor groups that actually did get into anarchy as sort of an end result of what would be best for laborers. And this is really, I would say, the last gasp of the anarchist movement, because I don't think now that we would consider anarchists to be any sort of relevant or existent political philosophy in any sort of impactful way. But after the 19th century, the movement starts dying because of all the violence, like here in America, the assassination of the president. Which one was that? Garfield?
In McKinley, I would think, which was the one who was assassinated by. Yeah.
Yeah. But so by the 1930s, anarchists have really lost their clout on the world stage. And so their role in the Spanish Revolution is going to be the last time you see anarchists really play an important role in a political movement. But that's going to be some of the ultimate problem, is that it's not just socialists, it's not just communists. This coalition of the left never really works well together. And ultimately, being involved with communists, being involved with anarchists provides a lot of fuel to burn down the loyalist cause internationally. A lot of Britons don't want to be involved because there's anarchists. A lot of Americans know that that's a dirty word to them.
Right.
And ultimately, it's what keeps the movement getting bigger. Add on top of that, one of the most important reforms for European countries coming out of the 19th century is deconstructing the Catholic Church, because it has so much power in politics, so much money, so much land. In South America, the way that the church is sort of deconstructed from public life is very controversial. It's very violent. And when the Spanish leftist government takes over, they start deconstructing the church as well. They start taxing it. They start removing land from the church. And then they're now painted as an anti-Christian government. And so for the entire war, the biggest support of Franco, of the fascists abroad, especially in America, will be Catholics. Even when some of the worst atrocities happen in the war, they become public knowledge. If you're familiar with Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica, is painted after the fascists bomb the city of Guernica and they murder tens of thousands of civilians in a moment. And that's actually the first time where people realize how destructive airplanes are going to be. And in World War II, we outdo Guernica by hundreds of fold. But even after Guernica, Catholic Americans are going to not question the righteousness of Francisco Franco, because he's fighting for the Catholic Church. He's not.
Well, strange bedfellows, I guess. After all, we see even today how certain unpious politicians win the support of large religious institutions here in the United States, don't we?
It's unfortunately such a common. I actually, when I was going back and looking at some of this information, it did remind me a lot of 2016, of sort of this moment where a lot of people who weren't vested in criticisms of the system are realizing how bold-faced those criticisms can be.
Right.
When you have a lot of, we'll say, like, privileged white people who in 2016 are like, man, is America a racist country? In the 1930s, during the Spanish Civil War, a lot of Americans were forced to ask, like, how far are we going to go to be anti-communist? And how far are we going to go to support stability? And how close are we to the fascists? And that question becomes more stark in World War II. Unfortunately, not stark enough, but there are a lot of people who are going to support social change after these moments, who are doing so because when confronting fascism, they realize how American it seems. And that unsettles them, and it should.
Right. So, so both of these gentlemen who you researched, Langston Hughes and Ernest Hemingway, are journalists during this period of time. And so they are reporting on all of this stuff. And I know you talked a lot about the role of bias in journalism at that point in time. Is this a time of a lot of sort of sensationalized journalism, or is this a lot of analytical, sort of ideological journalism, or is it just the facts, ma'am? Like, where is it?
Yeah.
Can you talk about that?
It's in a weird sort of transition phase, and that was some of the not funner, more interesting research I did was just the stuff into journalism specifically, and how in the 30s, America was still sort of responding to what journalism was going to be, like ethically, and what its place in society was. And it was difficult because when I talk about it and I write about it, whenever I talk or write about history, I try not to use too many phrases that are repeated from high school classes, where it's sort of like, because I don't want to make it seem like it's shallow repetitions of things.
Mm-hmm.
But really in the 30s, we're still responding in the United States to yellow journalism. So at the turn of the century, the idea that these muckrakers who just wanted to sell papers, whatever that would be, but some of the finest investigative journalism in the history of the world comes out of the muckraking era. Things that led to the creation of like the Food and Drug Administration and towards like Clean Water Acts and things like that. But also, war reporting is still relatively new in the 1930s. The idea that someone from America would cross half the globe to go to a war was pretty insane. I mean, it happened, but there's not really a lot of foreign correspondents going into foreign war zones and reporting on it. So when they get there, you see those two things combined on when they go to the war, are they there to support a cause? Are they there to support politics? Or are they there to be the just the facts kind of person?
Mm-hmm.
So we do have the pushback that journalists have to be objective. They have to go in without bias. We talk about as historians that is impossible to do.
Right.
And so the question is, are they mitigating their bias or are they leaning into it? And with the reporters in the war, there's a couple hundred who are there, these foreign correspondents. They run the entire spectrum. And so I really put the spectrum at like the closest thing to fully objective that you can be, which you can't, but the closest you can get to really telling an honest story. And you have the partisans who are like, I'm here to support my cause, but I do have some sort of obligation to the truth. And then the propagandists. Hughes is pretty close to a partisan, as is Hemingway. Both of them are willing to sort of tell specific stories in ways that aren't unethical, but definitely skew a little bit. None of them flirt with the idea of being propagandists, but they definitely are not trying to be totally objective.
Mm-hmm.
I would say in this war, the only people who I would put on the other spectrum of being objective are the people who went there as propagandists and had their mind changed. I don't have their names with me right now, but there were a few reporters who went there just to report on Franco. They were pro-Catholic, they were pro-fascist, whatever it was. And when they got to Franco's side, they were so disgusted at the abject violence, the complete lack of sort of a Christian nominal value. And then one of them specifically then went to the loyalist side. And one of the biggest things he had heard is that they were anti-Christian, anti-Catholic, and he went to pray and nobody stopped him. And he was like, I thought they were going to kick me out because of this. And that he was so effectively lied to, completely disgusted him. And he came home and his whole goal was like, you have got to stop supporting Franco. There wasn't anybody that was written down that supported the loyalists, the leftists, and then switched to fascism. There's a guy who comes pretty close, but he didn't necessarily support Franco. But there's also going to be, a lot of propagandists, a lot of people who go to the war who have no intention of doing anything but supporting the cause. There's a dude named Claude Cockburn, whose name is hilarious. And then he was just an absolute liar. But then, like George Orwell, who wrote 1984, Animal Farm, he actually fought in the Spanish Civil War. He wrote a book called Homage to Catalonia about his time there. George Orwell is a propagandist, for sure, like if we're going to put them on that spectrum. But it's not out of any sort of malicious intent. He literally put his blood and his health into that cause. And I think that was always clear what he was doing. Mm-hmm. There's never a question that he was trying to fool people,
So what is an example of, can you give us an example of a story that, say, Hemingway would have reported on and how it would show his partisanship, I guess, in a way?
Yeah, I think one of the more interesting ones I talked about, something they both do that makes them not quite propagandists, is they do try to keep humanizing the other side. Hemingway is going to come across some dead Italian, some of Mussolini's soldiers who he sent to Spain to fight, and he's going to reflect on how much time he spent in Italy as a young man in World War I, and he was like, I could have known that young man back then. And the idea is to not demonize those people. Langston Hughes does the same thing with black soldiers fighting for Franco, these colonized soldiers who fought for Franco. One of the things that Hemingway does that's quite subtle, it's a very common tactic, is you present people with a singular story, and you expect them to then expound that story to be a total truth. And the way that he does that, one of the best stories he does, he talks about a young man who was an avowed anarchist. So this is, of the people on the left, even worse than communists, nothing was worse than being an anarchist. Like, it was like Satan, anarchists, communists. Right? And so he gets this anarchist assigned to him as a driver, and Hemingway's sort of like, hey, I know what you're thinking. I thought he was a piece of shit too, but, I put up with him because he's my driver. And he describes that one day his driver got there late, gets out of the car's covered in rubble, which is common. They're in Madrid, in one of the centers of the fighting. This young man gets out and he's covered in blood, and Hemingway goes to check on him, and it's not his blood. He had come across a bombing on the way and had helped an older woman out of the rubble to a hospital. It was covered in her blood, and Hemingway was like, you shouldn't have come at all. Just go home. Like, get yourself together, like, be at peace, clean yourself up. And he was like, I'd never really met an anarchist before, but I can tell you that this young man was a good man.
Mm.
And this story, not too subtly, but is telling you, like, don't demonize these people. Just because they're anarchists doesn't mean they're evil. But he never holds your hand along the way. And actually, a lot of his news stories are written in the form of short stories.
Mm-hmm.
And so you're really quickly engaged in it and really quickly drawn into the story. And it forces you to admire this young man and respect him. And he did that out of one of the most hated groups of people in the war. As an example, sort of on the other side, one of the reporters for Franco's side writes about how he had heard that he had heard, he didn't say, he wasn't reporting it, he just said he heard that these anarchists had, like, viciously raped and murdered a bunch of nuns. And he was like, anarchists, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you're supposed to just encapsulate all anarchists rape nuns. Sorry, this is a little graphic. So I apologize for that. But it's sort of that same tactic of, like, here's a small instance that you're supposed to apply to everything.
Right.
And they both do it in separate ways, in better and in worse ways. And that was how Hemingway sort of painted it. He was like, here's a hero for you to apply to the whole movement.
Yeah. It is interesting how war kind of has that ability to shake everything up, to put anarchist and, Republican in the same truck, to put fascist and anti-fascist together in the same trench, or whatever. Like,
Yeah.
you have to mix and confront, and you describe these coalitions of people that make up the Franco side, and it's such a wide array, everything from these African soldiers, from these colonial soldiers, to Catholics, to Italians and Germans coming in, and then you have this whole mix of different people, and all of them are projecting their idea of what almost like the whole world should be like on this little country.
Yeah. I mean, definitely it's so easy to be overdramatic about these things. And when you're in, like, a classroom, especially a graduate classroom, they always want you to have some sort of big picture in mind.
Mm-hmm.
And what frequently happens is the picture gets too big, But I really do think that when you look at the makeup of the sides, like you're saying, you can see that this is obviously much bigger than who's going to be in charge of Spain. And when Hemingway talks about how this is about fighting fascism across the globe, when Hughes said this about fighting racism across the globe, they're not wrong. And the tragedy is when you see the response, particularly in the States, where those issues are, if they're acknowledged, are put to the side over some other largely, what do I want to say, frivolous issue. Like when you're looking at these fascists who are murdering people by the tens of thousands in a day, and you're like, but can I support communists? And that's also not to say, I mean, the leftist side did commit war atrocities, particularly the longer the war went on and the desperation set in. I mean, but Franco is going to put prisoners of war in concentration camps. The refugees, there's like 40,000 refugees who are trying to flee one of the last cities. I think it's Barcelona at the end of the war. And he's going to put them all in concentration camps and shoot the ones who would try to get away or resist. And he's going to burn the records of everything. Doing histories of the Spanish Civil War largely is done in foreign archives because the evidence in Spain has been gone for 90 years.
Well, considering he stayed in power till 1976.
Yeah. The year before Star Wars came out, Franco died.
Wow. Darth Vader.
Yeah.
himself.
He's the only fascist who really survives World War II. Other than, I guess, Hirohito is like the leader of Germany, but he's not really a fascist, right?
Of Japan, yes.
Japan, he was really a puppet of the fascists. But yeah, Franco's the only fascist who survives, and it's because he doesn't get involved in World War II.
That's something to think about.
Which actually, the thing I didn't get a lot of time to go into was sort of the post-war internationally, because I always want to look more into how Mussolini and Hitler felt about Spain bailing on them, because I always felt that was the deal, like, we'll help you in the Civil War, but when things blow up, you're going to be right there with us.
Yeah.
And imagining how World War II would have played out if Spain had become had joined the Nazis.
I didn't realize that. I guess I'd never really thought about it too much. That's who did Spain join? Were they neutral or were they on?
Spain was neutral, yeah, which is incredibly important. Now, the other thing too is in a lot of ways they had to be neutral. The only reason they were able to wage a modern war as a civil war is because they got so much technology and material from the Nazis. So in some ways, if they had been a combatant force, they would have had to be propped up by Hitler and by Mussolini, which would have just spread their materiel thinner, their manpower thinner. But to think that Spain would have been able to like block off the Mediterranean, what a difference that would have made in Africa, what a difference it would have made in the North Atlantic had Spain been a producing and fighting war power in World War II.
It boggles the mind. So,
yeah.
Can you talk about Langston Hughes and Hemingway, some of the things that we might be familiar with today in terms of their poetry or their novels and short stories that have some connection to their experiences in the Spanish Civil War?
Yeah. Langston Hughes, one of his biggest poems is I Too America. I've got his whole collected works next to me, with some of my favorites marked. But he's got a ton of poems about Spain. A lot of Langston Hughes stuff that's going to be the most long-lasting are poems about black physicality, where he talks about deserving space, where he talks about the inherent beauty of like black skin. And at the African American Museum, the new one downtown in DC, there are 2 quotes from Langston Hughes up on the walls. He's also a playwright. One of his more important plays that people might have seen is called Mulatto. At the time, it was dangerous to put the play on because the play depicted miscegenation, interracial relationships, and offspring, which was like a murderable offense in a lot of parts of the country. So that's really what Langston Hughes is going to remembered for now. Unfortunately, he's not quite as remembered as Ernest Hemingway. The other thing that Langston Hughes really, one of his legacies is Langston Hughes, one of his major themes is transatlanticism, the idea that black people across the Atlantic have a shared culture and a shared future. That's going to be a huge theme continuing in modern rap. Kendrick Lamar, Kanye West, all of these dudes use a lot of themes that Langston Hughes pioneered in a lot of ways. But with Ernest Hemingway, perhaps his most important work about the Spanish Civil War is For Whom the Bell Tolls. And if you've seen Watchmen on HBO, this is the exact same copy, not the exact literal same, but the same edition of the book that one of the characters reads on screen in Watchmen. So when I saw it, I was pretty excited. But this is literally about an American, Robert Jordan, who goes to fight in the Civil War. This is one of like Hemingway's big 4 that is considered like a big part of the American canon, and works like this are eventually why he's given the Nobel Prize in the 50s. So that's really their 2 works that are most popular. But also Hemingway at the time makes a pretty important documentary called The Spanish Earth that is shown to FDR, that he narrates, that is going to affect some people in the United States and how they think about the Spanish War.
All right. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to tell us about all of that today, Kevin. That was really fascinating. I did not know quite that much about the Spanish Civil War going into this, and I know that Hemingway was often traveling and gallivanting around some of these historical events, but I didn't know about the Spanish Civil War, and Langston Hughes was a nice addition to that research as well. It kind of gives you an interesting, well-rounded picture from an American perspective of a civil war in Spain that had global implications.
I think the two together, for me, they do, part of the reason that inspired this research ultimately on why the two of them is they're both in Madrid at the same time, and they meet each other, which was really cool because I'd never heard that Langston Hughes and Ernest Hemingway, these two amazing writers, had met.
Whoa.
And we ended up going to if I remember the story correctly, they went to a zoo together along with Martha Gellhorn, who eventually gets married to Hemingway, but on her own as a historical figure is one of the most important journalists of the era. Specifically, she reports in Czechoslovakia while the Nazis are invading. She's an incredibly important journalist. Martha Gellhorn is one of the most important journalists in the United States history. But the three of them go and they hang out together and they talk about the war, and the mind boggles at the sort of things that we've talked about. And Hughes wrote about their meeting together, and he said that it was incredible the way that Hemingway could instantly digest and then put out an event. Like, he described an event to Hughes that Hughes had been at, and it was like Hughes was sitting in the room again. And he was like, I could never do that. But ultimately, I think what's most disappointing about Hemingway is he is such a problematic writer, but he does have some silver linings about him mechanically as an author, the way that he redesigned sentence structures to get away from like old Victorian modes of wordiness and goes into the much simpler prose. And some of the themes he puts forth for his generation especially are so important as a historian, especially in literature. But he did believe in a more equitable world, a more just world, and he dealt with his own struggles. But when him and Hughes meet, Hughes is talking about how this is a fight against racism, and Ernest Hemingway, as someone who benefits from white supremacy, as someone raised in it, never takes that step beyond fighting fascism to fighting the greater oppression around the globe. And I think it disappointed Hughes, and I think it disappoints me, and that's something I think that, especially growing up in a lot of the, I want to say blue collar, but my heart says white trash, growing up around white trash people, you want them to make the same leaps, where you say, you recognize some of the injustice, but you have to go the step further. And sort of pulling people along that journey like Hughes tried to do for Hemingway, I think is something that speaks a lot of drama and a lot of interest to a lot of people.